I'm Lauren and welcome to my channel. So if you watched my video last week, I'm essentially doing a series on what happens after a concussion and where am I going forward. So what happened is that I have a concussion. I have trigeminal neuralgia, vestibular neuritis, and other headache syndrome. So what does this mean for me in the long term now? So after essentially getting all of these diagnoses done by this fantastic doctor in Miami, I also discovered through my concussion, I developed a learning disorder, disability, whatever you want to call it. And initially when I was diagnosed with it, it was just like you have a poor working memory. So that means a poor short-term memory, which means that like sometimes for like 2 or 3 minutes, someone would be talking to me and then I wouldn't remember the conversation. Sometimes I'd have the gist of the conversation, but I wouldn't have the entire conversation. Like in my head, I'd be like, oh, did you talk to me? And they're like, yeah, we just discussed this like 30 minutes ago. Or like I would tell someone and I already had a problem repeating things. And they're like, you told me this 6 times. I'm like, I have? And they're like, yeah, you have. I was like, oh, this is a problem. And so that's what I was initially diagnosed with, which was like, like poor working memory, very distracted. And, this was just like a preliminary short-term diagnosis. I did eventually need to go in for a long-term life psychosocial evaluation. I think that's what it's called. It's called a couple of different things, depending on who you go to. It took another life psychosocial evaluation, and they're like, by the way, you have one of the most unusual cases that we've seen ever. I was like, oh, that's great. And this woman has been doing these evaluations for like 20 plus years. She's certified in both the US and Canada. And it's like, you have one of the most unusual cases. And I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, you have a terrible working memory. It's basically non-existent. And so she's like, I'm like, okay. And then she's like, but you have great executive functioning, which I already kind of knew. She's like, yeah, you have a high ability to like take tests and do things and like be a functional human being and, be an active member of society, but your working memory essentially doesn't exist. Your long-term memory, once it's encoded. I'm like, okay, great. She's like, also, you're a very tactile person, meaning like touch is really important to me when I'm learning something. And I already kind of knew that too from medical school. Like I would do way better on the anatomy exams than I would do on like other exams and like my clinical OSCE exam. So that's like, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like the physical examinations because I could memorize it very easily and very quickly. And so she was just like, yeah, it's really weird. Like I have never seen this before. And I was like, oh, okay. And so along with that, she's like, by the way, I have some questions for you. And she kind of just asked me about like my childhood and what it was like and all these other things. Is like, how was my attention as a child? How did it change after I had got the concussion? And so she goes on to tell me, you have ADHD, attention deficit hyper disorder. Yeah, I'll put it here. And she's like, yeah, that's what you have, by the way, after reading the evaluation from the clinician so I had another clinician who was actually doing my tests, and then she essentially compiled and put all the information together. And she's like, and I was reading the report at one point, and just like at certain points she would just go off on a tangent and she wouldn't remember the task that she was focusing on, and I'd be like, I don't know what you're talking to me about. And he's like, and you'd have to repeat the instructions multiple times. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he's just like, and he's very nice and patient, and he repeated it to me again and things like that. And that went on for like, that testing lasted about 13 to 12 hours, 12 to 13 hours, I believe. So it's a very extensive like process to get a diagnosis or to get this kind of like disability recognized. And essentially to have this disability recognized in my 20s as a female is also really unusual. It's normally mostly diagnosed and misdiagnosed in young boys and young children because, kids are hyper and then the teacher's like, oh, they have attention deficit disorder. And not saying that they don't, but then some of them do get misdiagnosed and are misdiagnosed for years. So essentially I ended up having to go on medication for this because I have such a hard time focusing. I have such a hard time coping with it on some daily basis that it kind of just like, I just couldn't focus. You couldn't tell me left from right. And I was just like, I don't care. I'm going to do a million things a minute. And I'm not even kidding. With the ADHD medication that I'm on, it essentially, I said, it calms my brain. I'm not on it today, so sometimes that's why my videos are a little bit jump cutty, because I actually have to reorder it to make the story flow. And there's also the thing of just like, once I do take my ADHD medication, it calms my brain and allows me to think singular thoughts instead of multitasking very poorly. When I'm on my ADHD medication, I can multitask, but when I do the multitask, I can focus on one thought and focus on another thought, and then be like, okay, these are the two I need to execute at the same time. But then if you look at my brain when it's not on medication, it's kind of just like, oh, that's a bird. Oh, wait, are we talking about dinner? Oh, wait, are we talking about school? Oh, wait, are we talking about, what are we doing tomorrow? And it's just like scatters, and everyone's like, I cannot keep track of the way your thoughts are working. Like, my mom has literally told me, your thoughts are all over the place. I cannot keep track. I said, how did you get from talking about a Korean TV show to talking about light bulbs? And I'm like, oh, I guess I didn't give you my train of thought. Sometimes you're like, oh, I was watching this Korean drama. Oh, they were like, I think this lighting is really cool. Oh, I wonder what kind of light bulbs they use. And then I'm starting to talk about light bulbs and lighting and how it affects my migraines. And my mom's like, how did you get there? And I was like, I'm not really sure. Anyways, that is what comes with an ADHD diagnosis in your 20s. And dealing with it in my 20s. So if you have any questions about ADHD and like what it means for me in my 20s or anything else, please let me know in the comment section below. I know that there's this guy on YouTube who said the conversations in my head, and he also has ADHD or ADD, and he's like on that spectrum, and he wrote like a really interesting thing of like, other people don't have things talking in their head, and it's not schizophrenia. It's just like you just don't have ongoing conversations in your head. And I'll leave the link to that in the description box below. And then sometime, probably in the future, I'll talk about like, what are the conversations that I have in my own head? So, because it's been happening for years. So there's a long list of them. So, okay. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you back here soon. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on this video, and I'll see you later.